Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming for one more Cambridge webinar. Please tell us in the chat box where you are from. I see people from Iran, from Morocco, Brazil. Great. Chile, Peru also present. So good to have you all here. I'm Katia Valley, Schools and Exams Marketing Manager for Cambridge University Press, and today's webinar is going to be about facing the challenges of bringing cross-curricular content into the language classroom with our speaker, Viviane, one of the authors of Game Changer, our new teenage series. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. We have a certificate for this webinar. Please watch by the end of the presentation in the chat box. We will send you a link for feedback, and from this link, you can download your certificate. We are recording this session, and the recording will be available in our YouTube channel, Cambridge Brazil. Please send your questions to Viviane about the webinar in the Q&A tool we have here in Zoom. And now let me introduce you to Viviane, our speaker of this afternoon. Viviane Kirmeliene has been working in the ICELT field since 1994. She's a teacher trainer, ICELT editor, and materials writer. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in English from the University of São Paulo, the CPE, Cambridge Proficiency, and the Cambridge in-Service Certificate for English Language Teachers, known as ICELT. As an editor and writer, she has worked on a wide range of primary and secondary series for publishers in Brazil and abroad. She's interested in creating materials that engage children and teens and foster critical thinking. Good afternoon and welcome, Viviane.
Hi, Katia. Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I must confess that I'm a little bit nervous because, I haven't been presenting a lot lately because of the COVID pandemic, but it's great to be here, and I hope I can share my passion for bringing cross-curricular content to the English classroom with you all.
I'm sure you will. Enjoy the presentation, everyone. Thanks, Viviane.
Thank you, Katia. So let me share my screen here. Okay, just a moment. Let me just skip the presentation. Just a second. Okay, so can you see my screen? Oops.
Yes, all good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start by presenting our agenda for today's session. First, we're going to talk a little bit about your teaching context or contexts, because I know that sometimes teachers work in more than one school or teach different segments or different ages. Then we're going to define CLIL. I promise you this is going to be a short a short part of our session. Actually, you could have a whole year just talking about the different definitions and describing CLIL and its different versions. Then we're going to talk about the benefits of CLIL, how they can benefit our students and even make us better teachers. And I hope you're going to fall in love with it if you haven't already. But next, we're going to talk about the limitations of CLIL, because there are important limitations. When we think of let's say the original version of CLIL, we're going to talk about the different versions later. But when we think of the original version of CLIL, it might not work for everyone or in every teaching context. So maybe you're going to feel a little bit heartbroken at this moment. Next, I'm going to discuss with you some tips, actually 10 tips for a successful CLIL-inspired lesson. So if we're not able to work with all the elements of CLIL in our lessons, in our classes, we can work with some of its elements. So I'll be sharing with you 10 tips and a bonus tip, an important one. And then I hope that your hearts are mended after being broken. And we're going to finish with a questions and answers section. Okay, so and one important thing, we're also going to find out what these students having a science class in English have in common with these guys in this Asian mosaic. Yeah, we're going to find out what they have in common because they do have things in common. But first things first, I'd like to learn about your teaching context. From the chat window, I cannot see my chat, the chat box anymore, but from when I was looking at the chat window while Katja was talking, I realized that we have people here from all over the world. So I'm going to present 5 different teaching contexts and try to choose the one that you feel most that you are most identified with. Probably I won't be able to match everybody's teaching context, but try to choose the one that you're most, that is the closest to your reality, and write the number of this, of the corresponding speech bubble in the chat window, okay? So this is the first one. Another one for you, this is number 2. Number 3, number 4, and number 5. Okay, so please take your time, read the speech bubbles, and write in the chat window the number of the teaching context that is the closest to your reality. Okay, Katja, can you help me check the answers? Because I don't know why I cannot read, I cannot open the chat window.
Lots of numbers 1, some 5, some 1 and 3. We want to see some more. 1 is winning.
1 is winning?
Yes, either 1 or 5.
Okay, okay. Interesting. Interesting. So this will be very helpful. Okay. Oh, okay. Great to see teachers from public schools in this session. Okay, I think we can move on now. Okay, nice. So it doesn't matter your context. You're probably familiar with CLIL. You have heard of it. Okay. So even if you work with very few classes, if you work with 10 classes per week, if you work with in kindergarten, if you work in the public sector, you must have heard of it. Or maybe you haven't, and then you came to this presentation because you were curious about it. So now that we have the acronym on the screen, I'd like you to write in the chat window what you think the acronym stands for. Okay, so Katja, can you help me again?
Sure, Vivi.
So my question is, what does CLIL stand for?
Content and Language Integrated Learning from
Wow. Okay.
Miriam also, lots of people know.
Oh, this is great. Great. It's great to hear that. Well, so that's right. Okay, so that's right. CLIL stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning, and the term was coined by David Marsh in 1994, in a publication from 1994. But CLIL has a much longer history, and I'm sure that you have been working with CLIL in your classes without realizing that. So when it comes to the history of CLIL, we could say that the first non-CLIL activities, they date back to the age of the Akkadians, who conquered the Sumerians over almost 5,000 years ago, right? A long time ago. So in this image, you can see the first non-Sumerian Akkadian bilingual tablet. It was created around 2270 before Christ. So the image on the top is the the photo, you know, of this tablet, which was done on rock. And then the diagram that you can see below it shows the translation. So the language on the top is Sumerian, and the language below in the lower part of the tablet is Akkadian. So it's interesting to notice that although the Akkadians conquered the Sumerians, Sumerian was the language of zoology, theology, botany. The language of the ceremonies was Sumerian. So it's interesting to notice that the Akkadians had to learn Sumerian in order to study philosophy, theology, and other sciences. So CLIL is very old, actually. That's what I wanted to show you, that it has been happening for a long time. And when you think about the role of Latin, for example, of the Latin language in Europe throughout the centuries until, let's say, the 19th century, Latin was a language of science. Scientific books and theses were written in Latin. When you think of the Russian Empire at the time of Catherine the Great, the nobles in the Russian Empire spoke French. So French also had this this characteristic of being the language of sciences and the language of noble people. All right, so CLIL has been around for a long, long time. So let's talk a little bit more about CLIL. It is an umbrella term for many different things that we already do in class, that already happens in our classrooms. It is an approach to teach and learn content from other subjects in an additional language. In our context, this additional language is English, but it could be any language actually. So we could have this dual approach in different languages. It has a dual focus in this context. So people are going to learn content and language. The weight of content and language in CLIL programs will vary, will change depending on the version of CLIL that is adopted. We're going to talk about that later on in this presentation. This additional language or second language, yeah, we use both terms here in Brazil, is the medium of instruction of the subject. So I use English in this case, in our context, we use English to teach another subject. So English is the vehicle for students to learn and for teachers to teach another subject. CLIL is usually taught in a limited number of subjects, so we don't have all the subjects in the curriculum being taught in the additional language. Usually 2 or 3 subjects are selected. For example, students can have arts and science in English, or they can have geography and history in English. It is a way to respond to the demands and expectations of a globalized world. So there is this expectation of people being fluent, children, teenagers, adults being fluent in an additional language due to globalization. When we think of younger students, when we think of children and teenagers, here in Brazil, it has a high social value for parents. So this is something that parents value a lot, the ability of their children and teens to speak a foreign language, in our context here, English. Speaking again specifically of the Brazilian context, there has been a boom of bilingual programs, bilingual education. So several schools are increasing their hours, their teaching hours dedicated to English in the school schedule because of parents and parents' demands, and also the expectations of globalization that I have discussed before. And it is popular worldwide. It's not only a trend in some countries. CLIL has become popular everywhere. Yeah, and people have been talking about it. You know, it's the methodology of the moment, let's say. Okay, but is there just one type of CLIL? Not really. There are several versions, several different there are several different sub-approaches, let's say, to CLIL, and I'm going to talk about the two main approaches here, the two main, I'm calling them versions of CLIL, the two main versions, which are hard CLIL and soft CLIL. In hard CLIL, the programs are taught by subject teachers. So we have, for example, a math teacher. The emphasis is on content. So this math teacher is also fluent, on the second language. And this content, the content from the math classes is taught in English. And then all the math hours are taught in English. Okay, so this is hard CLIL. It's important to bear in mind that we usually have some subjects and the programs can last for a whole year. And then the second version here is soft CLIL, in which we have shorter programs, we have language teachers in charge of the classes, and okay, we work with content, language teachers focus on content, of course, but there is an emphasis on the linguistic benefits of working with this content. So this is called soft CLIL, and then for soft CLIL is the preferred version here in Brazil. And according to the things that I have researched for this session today, it is the most popular version of CLIL worldwide. Okay. Now, it's the moment for you to fall in love with CLIL if you haven't fallen in love yet. So some benefits of CLIL. Well, first is that language in CLIL's classes, language is taught and learned in natural and authentic contexts. So students have a genuine reason to learn the language. They have a reason to participate in class. They have a reason to ask questions because they have to focus on content that they need to learn, right? Another benefit is that there is an instructional focus on meaning rather than form. And even when we're talking about soft CLIL, in which we're going to focus on the linguistic benefits, we're going to learn language in order to perform a task. So for example, I'm going to use time sequencers in a science class to describe an experiment. Okay, so there's a focus on the meaning. Why do I need to learn about first, second, first, then, after that, and finally? Because I want to describe the science experiment that I carried out in my classes, right? Also, it is the most practical way to make cross-curricular teaching and learning a reality. Talking about, again, about the Brazilian context, we have here, when we read our official documents, the documents from our Ministry of Education, you're going to find cross-curricular teaching everywhere. You know, it's everywhere around the document. So, and teachers, Brazilian teachers, find it difficult to make it happen, to make this cross-curricular work happen. So CLIL is the easiest way to put that into practice. Another benefit of CLIL is that there is a higher motivation among students because there's more to learn than the language. So it's not only learning the language per se. I have to learn the language because I need to understand the content from my history class. I need to learn the language because I want to participate in my arts class. So there is an additional motivation. Another benefit is that CLIL lessons help students build their academic lexes and structures in this additional language. And this can be depending on the path the student chooses later in life, when we're talking about children and teenagers. Depending on the path they choose later in their academic life, this is extremely important because they are already familiar with the academic language from the subject area they're interested in. Another point is that CLIL takes the students' cognitive level into account. So when we are writing CLIL lessons, when we create our own lessons, or when we are adapting materials, or when we are choosing materials to work with in our lessons, we have to consider what our students are already able to do with that content. For example, the way I work with bacteria and viruses with students in primary level is totally different from the way I work with the same content, the same topic in secondary, right? So I'm going to choose, I have to choose the material according to students' level. So we have to consider that, and then students feel much more comfortable with the content. Also, as a consequence, there's a higher cognitive load in class. It's interesting. When we teach CLIL, maybe you have noticed that if you have taught CLIL sessions, you kind of see your students' brain, the brain cells working hard, because there's a lot to be done in class. They have to deal with language. They have to understand what you're saying. They have to be able to express themselves, use the language, but they also have to understand the content. So there's a higher cognitive load in class, and this is good. Okay, we're going to see that sometimes if the cognitive load is too high, this can be bad, but at first it is a benefit. Okay, so considering all these benefits, we can say that teachers love CLIL, right? So that's why it is such a popular methodology. It has so many benefits. There is so much we can do in CLIL sessions, so much our students can learn. So, you know, this is why it is so popular and beloved, let's say, as a methodology. Now, okay, so we're done. CLIL and teachers are married forever. They're in love, and everybody has to teach using this methodology. Not necessarily, because CLIL has limitations, right? It's interesting. I found this cartoon. Actually, it's a series of cartoons. We're going to see some more from a teacher in Spain. CLIL is very popular in Spain. It has been adopted for, I don't know, maybe for 2 decades in Spanish education in schools. But there are some limitations, and one of these limitations has to do with the language students have and the language they need to perform the tasks and activities that we propose. So there are limitations. So now it's the time that the teachers who are in love with CLIL might get brokenhearted. Some of them are students' low ability in the second language. When you're talking about hard CLIL, there must be a level of language skills in the second language. Otherwise, the students have to concentrate too hard on language and the subject at the same time. And then the cognitive load might be too high. Remember we were talking about the higher level of cognitive load as an advantage, as a benefit of CLIL. If it is too high, students might get frustrated and simply give up. They might say, no, this is too much for me. I can't cope with that. I don't want it anymore, right? So in some countries that adopt CLIL programs, there are language booster courses. So students, they kind of go to summer school, for example, and they take a whole month, or they take like 3 months of language classes to be able to cope with the CLIL sessions, right? This is an example from Bulgaria, for example, another limitation. If there is low exposure to the additional language outside the classroom, which is quite common in most countries, students might have problems as well. For example, if we think of migrant students in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in Australia, when they leave the classroom, when they leave the school, they are going to have loads of content of contact with English. English is going to be all around them, yeah, all over the place. But when a Brazilian student or an Argentinian student or a student from Morocco leaves the English classroom, these students are not going to see English. They might not get exposed to English outside the classroom. So this might be a problem as well, a limitation. Another point to consider is the students' literacy and cognitive skills in their mother tongue, right? According to research, students must have a good level of literacy skills and academic language in their own, in their mother tongue in order to succeed in a hard CLIL program, right? So if they don't have the academic language of science, for example, in their own language, it's going to be too challenging for students to learn this academic language in a foreign language, right? So this is another limitation. Another point, and this has to do with teachers. This session is a 50-minute moment for us to talk about CLIL, but learning the pedagogical skills of CLIL can take a long time because there are specific approaches, specific techniques that CLIL teachers should use in the classroom. So teachers need to have these pedagogical skills, and sometimes they might not have access or the funds for training. Another point is the lack of resources. If you want to study, if we want our students to learn about science in English, they must have access to resources, to books, to magazines, to content about science in English. And sometimes, depending on your teaching context, these resources are simply not available. And finally, the lack of time for planning, because planning a CLIL lesson, if you're not working with ready-made materials or with a textbook, planning a CLIL lesson can be highly time-consuming and frustrating, right? As you can see, as we can see in this cartoon, you know, because depending on your teaching context, you might have to change things all the time. You might have to adapt lessons all the time. So teachers might get frustrated and feel a bit overwhelmed by preparation. Okay, so these are the limitations of CLIL. I'd like you to use the chat window again. And I like you to write the number of the limitation that is the most significant for you, okay? You can choose more than one. So I'd like to understand the limitations to implement CLIL sessions in your context. Katja, can you help me again?
Sure. 3, 1, 1 and 2, 6, 1 and 2, all of them. All 1, 3, 4.
Okay. Okay, so there are
5 and 4, 2.
Interesting.
A little bit of everything.
A little bit of everything. Yes, yes. So the limitations have a significant role in our teaching context. So it's something that I felt when I was in the classroom and I had to work with CLIL. But then with all these limitations, is this the end of teachers' love story with CLIL? Are we going to be brokenhearted and say, okay, so forget CLIL, it's too difficult. I don't have the resources. I don't have the time. I don't have the materials. My students don't even know how to talk about science in their own language. How am I going to teach them to talk about science in English? Is this the end? Not really. Why not? Because there are course books with CLIL-inspired sections. Okay, nowadays you can find CLIL sections or CBLT sections in most course books for children and teenagers, and teachers can also create their own lessons. So let's mend this broken heart. Let's fall in love with CLIL again. Maybe not hard CLIL, but a version of soft CLIL, or let's think of CLIL-inspired lessons. So I brought here an example from Game Changer. Okay, the new series for secondary launched by Cambridge University Press here in Brazil. I'm one of the authors of the first level, and I wrote this this section that I'm showing you right now. It's called Across the Curriculum. As you can see here, the focus is on science, right? So here we have an infographic with tips for a healthy diet. Okay, so we're working with science, we're working with content that is important for Brazilian students according to the Brazilian curriculum. I'm going to show you that in a few moments. But in a way that both teachers and students are comfortable with. Let me show you another example. This is from the extras. We have some extra reading activities in Game Changer, and here the focus is on art, right? So if we want to work with CLIL-inspired lessons in our classes, what should we keep in mind? What are some tips, some points to bear in mind when we are teaching, designing, creating, writing, or adopting CLIL materials in our classes? The first one, and here I'm going to talk specifically about the Brazilian market, but you can apply that to any official document. I'm talking here about the thematic units, the objectives, and the skills from our official document, from the national curriculum, right? This is something new in Brazil. It may sound weird it may sound weird to people from other countries, but we haven't had a national curriculum until 2017, right? So now we have, a good idea to know, okay, so what can I work with? What can I do with my students? I want to bring content from other subjects into my class. So check your official document, check the official curriculum, because you're going to find lots of ideas there. You will learn what your students already know, from what your starting point should be, right? Here I selected, based on that class on healthy tips that I showed you, here I selected 2 skills from our official document. I apologize to our to people who don't speak Portuguese, but I can kind of translate it here. Actually, the first skill talks about organizing a menu, a balanced menu, according to different nutrients and individual needs. And the second skill is about discussing eating problems like obesity, lack of nutrients, and others. So basically, these 2 skills. So these skills here are in our national document for students in 5th grade. If they're working, for example, with Game Changer 1, they would be, in Brazilian schools, they would be like 11, 12 years old. In 7th grade. So students are already familiar with the topic. So my first tip is check the official curriculum, check the national curriculum in your country, and then you can find different topics you can work with in these documents. The second tip, and this is related to the first one, is to choose cross-curricular topics according to your students' cognitive level and also their interests. Yeah, it's maybe you can carry out a needs analysis in the beginning of the school year to find out what your students like. If most of your students, for example, have a special interest in science, this is a topic you can focus on in your CLIL-inspired lesson. Yeah, because of course, you're going to select some kind of input for the lesson. It can be a video, it can be a written text, it can be an oral text, or even one image. So your choice of input will depend on your students' cognitive level and also on their interests. The only thing here you have to be careful with, because this is the kind of mistake that I have already made, is that be careful with the material you're selecting. You know, try not to choose material that is too childish. Yeah, because sometimes we do that with the best of intentions, say, oh, I'm going to choose this because it's easier in terms of language. But then students feel patronized, or, you know, if you're working with teenagers and they see this material that looks like, that is aimed at students who are much younger than they are, they might say, oh, teacher, come on, this is for children, this is not for me, you know, and then you might lose your group, lose your class and their interest. Okay, so this is the second tip. The third tip Plan your lesson carefully. I know that lack of time is one of the limitations of CLIL, but you have to plan your lesson and then get help from the expert. The expert in this case is the teacher of the subject you're focusing on. So if you're teaching a science lesson and you feel a little bit insecure about the topic, talk to the science teacher. The same thing about history. If you don't feel comfortable with part of the content, or if you don't feel that you're being historically accurate, talk to the history teacher, okay? Your colleague will probably be more than happy to help you. So getting back to the plan, it's important to establish clear goals for your lesson. Try to focus on content as much as possible. Remember, it's not a language lesson, it's a content lesson. So for example, if you think of the idea of working with a healthy diet, one clear goal could be learn some tips for healthier eating habits to make better choices. Yeah, this is one possibility, one goal that we can have. And also, and this should be part of your plan, think of how you're going to help and guide your students as they receive and produce new content. This is what we call scaffolding. How are you going to help your students understand the content and then produce language to speak and write using this new content? This should be also part of your plan, because the more prepared you are, the lower the chances of leaving your students behind. But it's also important to keep in mind that language is the vehicle to learn about content and not the other way around. Okay, it's not that content is the reason why we're learning the language. Okay, it should work the other way around. But we also have to remember that we plan a lot. We try to anticipate difficulties, but things can go wrong, okay? And when you start working with CLIL lessons, this is going to happen a lot. Let me tell you, say, oh gosh, I selected this content. It seemed wonderful, but my students aren't interested in it. Or they couldn't produce language because they didn't provide a language frame. They didn't have enough vocabulary to deal with that. I didn't scaffold their practice. So things can go wrong, and that's okay. All right. I think we teachers sometimes we are very hard on ourselves. So things can go wrong. And sometimes we have to leave the plan and change our plan, change our mind, change materials, change our lesson completely in the very middle of it. The fourth tip, which has to do with planning, remember to prioritize the content. Keep in mind the language is the vehicle. So when we're working, for example, thinking of that example of the tips for a healthy diet, students will naturally be exposed to a lot of language. Okay, so there is language going on. They will be exposed to food vocabulary. If we're talking about a list of tips, as we had in that infographic that I showed you, there's a lot of imperative going on there. Yeah, when you think of structures, students will use the imperative a lot. So language is there, right? But remember that your focus should be on the content. Next tip. And this is a very interesting tip because we can learn a lot from other subjects. Try to incorporate strategies and tools from the target subject into your lesson. So again, if I'm talking about science, I can bring some elements from science, some strategies, some tools from science, and I can use them in my lessons. Here, for example, we have the Eat Well Guide, which is a diagram from the NHS, the health department in the United Kingdom. So I can work with this graph, with this diagram, which is not so common in English classes. It's a tool from science, it's a tool from math, and I can use that in my lessons. This is good because students are familiar with that. Maybe you're not, as a language teacher, you're not familiar with graphs, with diagrams like this one, but your students are, because they see these elements and these tools in other subjects. Some other examples here. The diagram, we can have a table with different information with the percentages here. And then we also work a little bit with math. We can work with tables as a strategy to present and to produce content. Lists, okay, these are all elements from other subjects that we can incorporate into English teaching, okay? Next tip. And then now we're going to move on and talk about the class, the lesson itself. Try to start your lesson by activating students' background knowledge of the topic. They know a lot about the topic, trust them, okay? And then help them also to express their ideas, to share what they know in that target language. So something that I always do is to keep this language bank on the board. So I usually separate like a third or a fourth of my board for the language to the language bank. So here we have some language chunks that students can use to express their idea. So we activate their schemata, we activate their previous knowledge. You can ask them, okay, so tell me, what do you know about having a healthy diet? What are the advantages of eating healthily? And then the language bank can help students express these ideas, share these ideas. Another nice thing about asking students what they know of an advantage of activating previous knowledge is that you're showing your students that you're actively listening and valuing what you're saying. You show students that you value their capacity to think and their contributions to the class. Okay, next. Tip number 7, which is closely related to tip number 6, encourage your students to anticipate content from the input text. So, for example, if I'm working with that infographic, you know, about the tips for a healthy diet, I can ask them, just look at the images. What do you think the text is about? We're going to read this text here. What is it about? Okay, so you can have, for example, students quickly discuss this question, make predictions about the text they are about to read. And then again, it's an approach that has several advantages because you're giving students a reason to explore the input content that you're going to provide. For example, they have to read the text to check their ideas. It requires, when we have students working in pairs or in small groups with this question, it requires interaction among them. And it's also another opportunity for them to share previous knowledge and for you to show them that you care about what they know. Yeah. You can also provide a language frame on the board or chunks to help them express their ideas. Tip number 8. Now, when you start working with the text, it can be a written text, an oral text, a video, whatever you bring as input for your CLIL inspired lesson, be ready to guide your students through the comprehension skills demands. Skills demands here are reading, listening, and watching skills. Yeah, students will need these skills to navigate through the content that you're presenting. So if you are planning your lesson, if you're creating your materials, make sure you include a variety of activities, different tests, different types of comprehension tasks, not only true or false, right? Try to think of the most suitable options for your students to support their comprehension, and also the most suitable types of activities, types of tasks for the content. Right? And if you're working with a CLIL lesson from a textbook, don't be afraid of tweaking things, of changing things around a bit. As I always say, the teacher is the master of the class. I mean, teachers know their students, they know their teaching reality, they know their students' needs. So the teacher is the best person to make choices. So don't be afraid of changing things around, even when you're working with a course book. Tip number 9, and this is an important one, and it's a very specific thing about working with CLIL content. It is important to make key language salient, to highlight the language students will need to understand the content you're presenting, and also to produce new content based on your input. Here I have an example from a material that I selected. Sorry, this is not from Game Changer. I kept here the reference, but this is not from Game Changer. This is from a material produced by the NHS, the British Health Department, about healthy eating, about the Eat Well Guide. So here I selected some words that I think students using this text would need to know, maybe prior to the text, or that I should put in a glossary box, but students need to know these words. So I highlighted key language here, key vocabulary in this case here for students. So this is another important tip. When you're preparing your lesson, try to when you're talking about ready content that is already provided to you, read the content and try to select, underline, or highlight the language or the vocabulary that you think that your students will need to understand the text and also to produce language. Okay, and then you can either teach this content before you approach the text. You can have a pre-reading task or pre-listening task working with this vocabulary, or you can prepare like a glossary box or a language box and for your students with this language. Okay. Finally, tip number 10, we talked about comprehension, and we have to think of the production as well. We need to be ready to support our students' spoken and written output. They're going to produce language based on the input you gave them. Okay, in most lessons, if you think of a complete cycle of a lesson, we start with input and we finish with output. So as teachers, we must encourage and support students' oral and written production in our classes. For example, if we have speaking activities in CLIL contexts, you can provide a language frame on the board again. The students will need more formal scaffold. You can provide models, you can provide some language practice before the task, the word list that we talked before. Here, I'm going to show you an example of a possible board to work with a CLIL lesson. To answer this question, let me just get back to the previous slide. Let's imagine that students have to participate in a discussion. This is the output. Students have to participate in a discussion to answer these questions. Do you think that it is a good idea to have a meat-free day every week? Why or why not? And then here we have on the left a language frame for them to express their ideas. They can say, I think it's a good idea because, I don't think it's a good idea because. And of course that depending on students' production, the teacher could add more elements to this language frame. And here on the right, I created like a word bank with vocabulary that students might need in this discussion. Okay, so we finished our 10 tips, but I have a bonus tip. And maybe this is the most challenging thing to do in a CLIL lesson, because we have the comprehension skills, we have the skills for production, we have to guide students, we have to support students, but we also have to help our students think. We have to be prepared to support our students' thinking skills, right? And what are thinking skills? Well, there are lots. Here, I use this classification of critical thinking and creative thinking. So in CLIL sessions, the students can compare and contrast. They might need to prioritize. They might need to evaluate content, visualize things, make hypotheses. Again, when we're talking about thinking skills, we could have like a whole year, a whole course just discussing these higher order thinking skills and Bloom's taxonomy. It's a fascinating subject. Maybe this could be the topic of another webinar, right? But this is very important. You have to help students think. And in your planning, if you plan your lesson carefully, you will be able to anticipate the moments in which you're going to have to interfere to help them think about the content, think about the tasks and activities that you're proposing. Okay. Well, these are the tips. I talked a lot. And I'd like to leave you, before our questions and answers, I'd like to leave you with a final message. This is a quote from John Dewey, an American philosopher and educational reformer. And I love it because sometimes I feel that we're still teaching our students as if they were students in the 19th or 18th or even the 17th century. And we have to aim at the future. We have to look at the future when we're working with them. Okay, so this is my final message. And I think that when we work with content from other subject areas in our classes, this is a way of looking into the future. It's a way of teaching our students to be ready for tomorrow. Okay, and now our questions and answers.
Great, Vivi. Thank you so much for such an informative presentation.
Thank you, Katja. I'm still very nervous.
No, but you don't look nervous, and lots of positive feedback here in the chat.
Great.
We have some questions for you.
Okay, let me just have some water.
Sure. Just take our time.
Okay, go ahead.
Take a good breath. Elvis Campos asks you, what areas of the curriculum are more likely to be considered to work under CLIL?
I think it depends a lot on the school's philosophy, the school's choice, but from my experience, I have seen arts, arts classes taught in English, science, because we have lots of hands-on experiments you can do, can be a lot of fun. I would say that arts and science. I have also seen some schools working with physical education. When I'm talking about schools, I'm talking about regular schools, right? But you can use that in language institutes as well. I would say arts, science, and physical education. And I think these are also the easiest areas for us language teachers to work with as well.
I agree with you, Vivi. And a second question, which authors are best to study CLIL? Which are your favorite ones, or the ones you think are most interesting?
Yeah, the last slide, not the last, but the next slide in this presentation is a list of references, and I can share that with you as well. I love a book by Phil Ball, Keith Kelly, and John Clegg about CLIL. It's called Putting CLIL into Practice. I love this book because we have one part. The first part is dedicated to presenting the theory of CLIL, the different types of CLIL, its limitations and approaches and possibilities. And then we have like other 3 or 4 chapters, long chapters, only dedicated to, hands-on activities and what you can do in CLIL sessions, in your CLIL classes. So I love this book. This is my CLIL Bible. But of course that we have to talk about David Marsh as well. He has many contributions. He was the one who came up with the term CLIL back in 1994. So David Marsh has several publications as well.
Yes, I have posted in our chat. And if you enter the Cambridge website, you have it there. This book that Viviane is mentioning is by Cambridge University Press, and we have others too. The name is David Marsh.
David Marsh.
Yes, Tatiana is asking. All right, Vivi, we thank you so much. We don't have, let me just check again. We have one more question from
Great.
Miriam Matumoto. Do you pre-teach vocabulary by translating words in CLIL classes for kids who don't know much English?
I always try to avoid translation in class. I think if we choose materials in the right cognitive level, we can work with other resources. We can work with images, for example. You can create a visual glossary for students with the words before class. I think I know that sometimes translation is faster, translating content into students' mother tongue. But again, I think we have to keep this cognitive load high. So when working with children, if we choose the right materials, we will be able to provide visual support. Of course, that it depends a lot on the teaching context, but from my experience, when we work with the right material, we can provide visual support.
All right, Vivi. I think that's all from our participants. If you please show your next slide so that
Sure.
people can have a look at your references.
Yeah, here are the references.
Very good.
The last reference is the Eat Well guide that I showed you in some of my slides that I use as a reference. It's a great source to create a CLIL lesson, and it's totally free. It's online. It's a material created by the public health system in the United Kingdom.
Great. We have one more question. Let's take advantage of time.
Yes, of course.
All right. How can we approach students who possess knowledge in English, but tend not to express themselves in English?
We have to provide the language frame. And then this is going to demand some pre-teaching. So when we're planning our lessons, we have to think of the scaffolding, all the support that students will need to be able to produce in that language. So in some slides I showed the board with the language chunks. Maybe we should even provide more than that. Maybe we can provide a script for them in the beginning, a script they can read from, so they can feel confident that they can express themselves in English. Of course, they will be reading. Maybe this is not something that they created, but at least you start building their confidence in their ability to speak English in class. So this is my tip. This is my advice. Provide lots of support. Be there, be around, ready to help them. Sometimes you have to start with a script. And then, after some classes, you reduce the level of support, the level of scaffolding you provide to students. I can't hear you, Katja.
Oh, I muted myself. Sorry.
That's okay. No problem.
Yes, I'm just checking if we have more questions. No, we don't. That was the last one. I have just typed our general email, atendimento.br@cambridge.org. Vivi is also showing you a bit.ly address if you want to have a look at Game Changer Executive Preview. Let's allow people some time to take a picture. Lots of thank you. People are amazed of how much you have shared, Vivi. Thank you so much
thanks
for
a
the
lot.
content you prepared for this session. I have told you that we will have this recording available in our YouTube Cambridge Brazil channel. Also, you have the link in the chat box for you to send us feedback and get your certificate for this session. So, Vivi, well done. Thanks very much for being here with us. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and see you all next time. Enjoy the weekend.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you.